Technology as we know it has been changing by leaps and bounds. In the past 20 years or so, we've seen a revolution in computers. We've seen, well, it's much more than a revolution in mobile phones. And of course, automotive technology has been progressing for decades now. But as the number of cars grow, as the number of transportation vehicles grow, air pollution has been a concern, and we know it very well. What India is going to introduce next year, in April 2020, it's a landmark for India. It's going to introduce its toughest emission standard till date. It's the Bharat Stage 6 standard. It's roughly based on the Euro 6 standard that's already applicable in Europe. What will the Bharat Stage 6 cars offer? They'll be cleaner, they'll be more efficient, they'll be less polluting. But there are lots of doubts in the minds of customers about cars available today, which are the Bharat Stage 4 standard cars, versus what will be available from April 2020, the Bharat Stage 6 standard cars. Today we are going to drive this Mercedes and try and answer your questions about Bharat Stage 6. Why this Mercedes? Well, incidentally, Mercedes-Benz India was the first manufacturer to announce that well before the deadline of April 2020, they're going to make their whole lineup Bharat Stage 6 compliant. This E-Class, this E220d that we're driving today, is already Bharat Stage 6 compliant. So it only makes sense to understand the new standard better. We're going to drive a car that already meets it. Let's see how it goes. The single biggest change in cars to meet Bharat Stage 6 standards are going to be after exhaust treatments. Now, what are after exhaust treatments? You see, every time an engine burns fuel, there's a certain amount of polluting particles that are created. These pass through certain catalytic converters to reduce the pollution. But to meet Bharat Stage 6, only those catalytic converter solutions are not going to cut it. What companies are going to fit are called DPF, diesel particulate filters or petrol particulate filters. What these do, well, they have a certain chemical formulation, a urea-based liquid that is injected into the polluting particles coming out, which takes away a lot of the pollution and enables these engines to meet Bharat Stage 6 emission standards. Of course, what that does is the car needs more space to fit that urea particle to have that injection mechanism to work effectively. And that urea tank is not unlimited, it runs out after a while. When it runs out depends on your driving conditions, also the car, the size of the tank, but it needs to be refilled regularly. While we drive this, I'm going to give you more details on how the particulate filter mechanism works, what are the pros and cons of it, and how much we can expect them in India next year. When it comes to BS6, I think the first question that pops up in everybody's mind is, are the cars any different to drive? Well, I'm driving the E220d. This generation of the engine now produces 192 bhp, 400 Nm of torque. And to be honest, it's extremely refined. It's very easy to drive. And I think it would be, unless you're told that this is a BS6 versus a BS4, or unless you are a tester who has access to pollution measuring equipment, it's pretty much impossible to tell the difference between a BS4 and a BS6 engine, at least in the E-Class that we're driving. What happens when the BS6 standards, particularly in diesels, come to smaller cars? I'm not so sure, but I don't expect it to be that different. The E-Class, of course, remains, it offers you the features that have made it the best-selling car in its segment. In India, it's a huge success worldwide, and you can see why. It's really comfortable, it's really easy to drive, it's got acres of space, especially in the rear seat. It's fantastic. There's none of its rivals can really match that rear seat space. The air suspension works terrifically well, and just the quality levels, equipment levels, refinement levels, it's a really good car, and you can understand why it sells so much, why it's so popular among customers. Yes, on paper with the BS6 engines, it's even more cleaner, less emissions. So all that has made a difference, but practically, as an experience, this E-Class is as good as any other version. And I mean, there's hard to find flaws with it. Now, coming back to the whole BS4 versus BS6 confusion, essentially, like I said earlier, BS4 allowed the cars or vehicles to pollute to an X limit. BS6 takes this, you see, this is 2 steps up, because in normal scenario, you would go from BS4 to BS5, BS5 to BS6. Here, we've gone straight to BS6. We've taken a 2-step jump. So that always makes a big difference. Now, the vehicles will be far less polluting compared to BS4. If it was BS5, the change would be somewhat marginal, but in this case there's a big change, and I think it's going to impact overall emissions. A few factors that are very critical for the implementation of BS6 in India. You see, Supreme Court has laid down the guideline. 1st April 2020, you can't do anything. You have to sell BS6. If you have BS4 stock, that's your problem. So that aspect is there. The other big part of BS6 vehicles is the availability of very high quality fuel. Now, even under BS4, certain amount of high pollutants in the fuel were allowed. But in BS6, the biggest factor is that the sulfur content in fuel, both in petrol and diesel, has to be under 10 parts per million. So that's a big deal. The government, of course, is committed to getting that into pan-India before April 2020, because implementing BS6 without the clean fuel is always going to be a tough job. Here, Mercedes has done something unique. They've manufactured their BS6 engine, which they're introducing into the range, which is compatible with BS4 fuel, and that's no mean feat. I mean, that's a big achievement as far as engineering is concerned. The other factor that a lot of customers ask me, when BS6 comes in with the new fuel, will our BS4, BS3 cars comply? Yes, it's backwards compliant. You will not have an issue running your BS4 or BS3 cars on BS6. But running BS6 vehicles on lower quality fuel is always going to be a problem. So that's something that the government has to be very particular about. The other thing that would be that is sort of going to be a big turning point is that BS6, like I said earlier, needs exhaust treatments. Now, to fit that exhaust treatment, you need extra space, there's cost, there's weight, there's extra maintenance, because when the fluid level goes down, you have to refill it. Like on the E-Class and most of Mercedes' range, the minute liquid, the urea liquid that is filled in, Mercedes calls it AdBlue, it gives you a warning and tells you that you need to fill up. In fact, after a level, if it completely dries out, the engine either refuses to start or goes into limp home mode, making it that much more sort of making you do the effort of putting in the fuel or taking the service center, putting in that liquid fuel to make sure that the pollution cleaning system works absolutely perfectly. How that will be implemented in smaller cars, that remains to be seen. Second thing, what everybody has been saying, there is a certain amount of cost attached to BS6 technology. All that technology does not come cheap. So will we see prices of cars going up when BS6 comes in? I think that's very likely. And like I said earlier, in smaller cars, fitting that system is going to be a tight squeeze. So expect some smaller cars to not have diesel engines when BS6 comes in, because the cost ratio versus the product ratio, the value for money ratio that the Indian customer looks for might be taken away. So those are important points. And one last issue that is going to be there with BS6, especially in diesel vehicles, you see, getting the exhaust up to a certain temperature, you have to understand, because diesel is ignited by compression rather than by spark plugs and other properties. The diesel exhaust temperature, the temperature of the gas coming out from the engine, is much lower than petrol. So the petrol exhaust actually responds better to Euro 6 treatment, the after exhaust treatments, and in diesels it's a little tricky, especially because of the Indian driving cycle. You see, to get the exhaust after treatment system up to temperature, to get it working ideally, you need to get the vehicle up to a certain speed, you need to get the vehicle engine sort of warmed up to a certain speed. In urban Indian driving conditions, with the low speed that we are perpetually stuck in traffic, that's going to be one problem, because if this constantly happens, if you constantly drive at low speeds and the after exhaust treatment can't work properly, that system gets clogged up and replacement is going to be expensive. So that's one concern other than the fuel quality that is to be taken care of. But in return, let's be honest, when it comes to pollution norms, when it comes to a lot of other things, especially safety norms, this Bharat Stage 6 is a very positive step. And the two biggest things we'll see in India, if enforced properly, is cars that will pollute less, cars that will be more efficient, cars that will reduce air pollution to a level. And in today's scenario, that can only be a positive as far as I'm concerned.